He installed the camera out of sheer desperation. After years of silence and a fortune spent on the world's top specialists, the millionaire needed to know why his non-verbal son would only smile for the maid. What he witnessed through that hidden lens would unravel every expert opinion and reveal a communication breakthrough hidden in plain sight. The father was David Chen, a tech entrepreneur who had built an empire solving complex problems. But the one problem he couldn't solve was how to reach his own son, Leo. For 5 years, Leo had remained locked in his own world until a quiet woman named Marisol entered their home, and she held the key, using nothing but the forgotten songs of her own childhood. What David Chen was about to discover would challenge everything he believed about progress, expertise, and where true connection is found. What David Chen was about to discover would challenge everything he believed about progress, expertise, and where true connection is found. David Chen's life was a blueprint of control. By 35, he had founded a billion-dollar data analytics firm by believing in one principle: every problem, no matter how complex, could be broken down, analyzed, and solved with the right algorithm and enough capital. But his son, Leo, was the one dataset that refused to make sense. Leo was diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder at age 2, and by 5, he was classified as nonverbal. He lived in a world of profound silence, punctuated only by moments of overwhelming sensory distress. He did not respond to his name. He avoided eye contact as if it were a physical blow. The world of speech and language, the very currency of human connection David had mastered, was a locked room, and his son was on the other side of the door. So David did what he did best. He allocated resources. Over 3 years, he spent over $250,000 on a relentless parade of the world's top specialists. There was the behavioral analyst from Boston, charging $400 an hour, who used strict repetition and reward charts. There was the speech pathologist from Switzerland, who employed cutting-edge iPad communication devices. There was the neurologist, who prescribed off-label medications, and the occupational therapist, with a room full of sensory integration equipment. Each expert came with impeccable credentials and a confident promise, and each one, in time, left the Chen household with the same sobering report: minimal progress. Leo would sometimes parrot a word in a session, but it never carried over. He remained trapped, and David felt the crushing weight of a failure his money could not fix. The one constant in their home was Marisol. She had been hired through a premium agency 2 years prior, not for any specialized skill, but for her discreet and thorough housekeeping. A quiet woman in her early 30s, she moved through the minimalist mansion like a ghost, polishing surfaces and folding laundry with a serene efficiency. David barely registered her presence, which was, he assumed, the point. But then he began to notice the anomalies. He'd walk into a room and see Leo, who typically rocked or stared at his fingers, sitting perfectly still, his head tilted toward the hallway where Marisol was humming a tune while she worked. Once, David was certain he heard a soft, melodic clapping game coming from the sunroom. When he entered, he found Leo and Marisol sitting on the floor, facing each other, their hands moving in a slow, rhythmic pattern. Leo was not smiling, but his body was calm, his eyes fixed on Marisol's moving hands. When David asked her about it that evening, Marisol simply wiped her hands on her apron and said, "Oh, it is nothing, Mr. Chen, just an old hand game from my village. It helps pass the time." She offered no further explanation, and David, embarrassed to be interrogating the maid about childcare, dropped it. But the incidents accumulated. A stack of report cards from the specialists on Leo's desk noted zero spontaneous social interaction. Yet David's security system log showed that every Tuesday and Thursday, between 3 and 3:45 in the afternoon, Leo would voluntarily leave his room and go to the kitchen, Marisol's domain. The nanny, a certified professional, reported that Leo was most compliant after Marisol's shifts. Then came the day David found the drawing. It was on the back of a grocery list, a crude but unmistakable stick figure with long hair next to a small figure with spikes for hair. Above them, in wobbly letters that could only have been guided by an adult hand, was written, "Leo Y. Marisol." His son, who would not hold a pencil for his occupational therapist, had drawn a connection. A cold, proprietary dread settled in David's stomach. Was this woman manipulating his child? Was she seeking some sort of leverage? His mind, trained in risk assessment, cycled through worst-case scenarios. Or was there something genuine happening in his home that $250,000 in professional help had failed to produce? He ordered the camera system the next day. It was a state-of-the-art wireless unit with crystal-clear audio, marketed for home security. He told himself it was a precaution, a way to ensure his vulnerable son's safety. He placed the small, discreet device on a high bookshelf in the living room, angled to capture the large rug where Leo sometimes played. He did not tell his wife, who was away on a prolonged trip to care for her own mother. He did not tell the nanny. And he certainly did not tell Marisol. For a week, he watched nothing but routine scenes. Marisol cleaning, Leo drifting in and out. Then, on a Tuesday afternoon, with the late sun streaming through the windows, he saw it. Marisol finished dusting and sat on the rug, not next to Leo, but a few feet away. She did not speak to him. She did not try to coax him. She simply began to sing. Her voice was low and warm, singing in Spanish. It was a simple folk tune, a children's song about a little bird. She sang it through once, then again, clapping a slow, steady rhythm on her knees. On the third repetition, Leo, who had been lining up blocks, stopped. He didn't look at her, but his body stilled. Then, with a deliberate slowness that made David lean forward until his nose almost touched the monitor, Leo began to rock in time with the clapping, back and forth in perfect sync. David's breath caught. It was the first unprompted, coordinated social response he had ever witnessed from his son, and it was happening with the maid during her cleaning break for free. He became obsessed. He watched the footage every night, fast-forwarding to the moments Marisol was present. He saw patterns emerge. She never used Leo's name with pressure. She never demanded a response. She offered rhythm, melody, and touch through games like Pat a Cake. She used the songs of her own childhood, songs that had been passed down orally for generations, songs that had no therapeutic claims or peer-reviewed studies behind them. And Leo was responding, not with words but with his body, with a glance held a second too long, with a hand tentatively reaching out to meet hers in a clap. And then one afternoon, David saw the Holy Grail on his high-definition screen. After finishing a round of a clapping game, Marisol smiled and said, "My bien, Leo." And Leo, his eyes on the pattern their hands had made, let the corners of his own mouth turn up. It was faint, but it was undeniably a smile. The specialists had charts for effect that always read flat. They had never gotten a smile. David felt a turmoil of emotions, a dizzying hope mixed with a profound, disorienting jealousy. Why her? What did she know that they did? He had to understand. He decided to confront her, to demand an explanation. He planned to do it the next afternoon after her shift, but the next afternoon, something different happened. Marisol didn't go to the living room rug. She led Leo to the sunroom, out of the camera's fixed view. For 30 minutes, the feed showed an empty room. David's anxiety spiked. What were they doing? When they returned to view, Leo's demeanor was different. He was holding a small, smooth stone Marisol must have given him. He was not just calm, he looked focused, intent. And as Marisol gathered her cleaning supplies to leave, she did something she had never done before. She looked directly at the bookshelf, right at the camera's hidden lens, as if she knew it was there all along. She didn't smile, she didn't look angry. Her expression was one of deep, unsettling sadness. Then she turned and walked out. David sat in his darkened office, the glow of the monitor the only light. The video file had ended. The silence in the room was absolute. The camera had not given him answers, it had only shown him the lock. And now, the one person who might hold the key had just looked directly into his secret and walked away. He had to know what happened in that sunroom. He had to know what she knew, and he had to find out before she disappeared forever. He had to know what happened in that sunroom. He had to know what she knew, and he had to find out before she disappeared forever. The next morning, David waited for Marisol in the kitchen, the hidden camera's memory card in his hand. He expected denial, an excuse, or even resignation. He did not expect her to smile sadly and say, "I have been waiting for you to ask, Mr. Chen, but I must show you. The answers are not in my words, but in a place you have never looked." She did not wait for his permission. She simply walked out of the kitchen and down the hall toward the sunroom. David followed, his prepared speech crumbling. The room was bathed in morning light. In the corner, Leo was quietly stacking colored rings. Marisol did not approach him. Instead, she sat on the floor several feet away and began to hum. It was a different tune, one with a winding, repetitive melody. After a moment, she spoke without looking at David. In my village in Oaxaca, we do not have specialists for children like Leo. We have abuelas and tias and the songs they have sung for 100 years. We have hands that have held Barbies for generations. We believe that the spirit of a child who does not speak is not broken. It is listening to a different music. She then began a game, one David had not seen on the camera. It was a hand-tapping sequence on the floor, right hand, left hand together, creating a complex rhythmic pattern. Leo, without looking up from his rings, began to tap his own foot. It was not the same pattern, but it was a response, a conversation in rhythm. David felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. He was witnessing a dialogue without a single word. How was all David could manage? The brain seeks patterns, Mr. Chen, Marisol said, her eyes on Leo. Your specialists use patterns too, but their patterns are made of words and commands. For Leo, words are like a storm. They are too fast, too confusing, but a steady rhythm, a melody that repeats, a touch that is always the same. This is a safe harbor. This is a language he already understands. She explained that the songs were lullabies and play songs, what anthropologists call the oral tradition. The hand games were variations of jugo de manos, passed from older children to younger ones. They were designed over centuries to teach coordination, social turn-taking, and emotional regulation through play, not therapy. She had grown up with them, and she had used them with her own younger brother, who was also un niño de la luna, a child of the moon, their village's term for a child who was different. David was stunned. He had spent a fortune on proprietary methods, and the key might have been a set of folk traditions available to anyone for free. But then Marisol delivered the first seismic shock. There is more, Mr. Chen. In the sunroom yesterday, I was not just playing. I was testing an idea. Watch. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, smooth river stone. She began to tap it in a new rhythm against the floor. Tap, tap, pause, tap, tap, tap. After the third repetition, Leo stopped stacking. He turned his head not toward Marisol, but toward the large window. He pointed. For the first time in 5 years, Leo had pointed to indicate interest, not because he wanted something, but to share an observation. A cardinal had landed on the windowsill. David's heart hammered against his ribs, joint attention. It was one of the most fundamental, yet most elusive, social milestones his specialists had targeted for years, and it had just happened with a stone and a rhythm. How did you know? David whispered. Marisol's expression grew solemn. Because it is what worked for my brother, and because, Mr. Chen, I am not just a maid, I was a teacher. In my country, I had a degree in early childhood education. I worked in a school for children with special needs for 6 years. The revelation landed like a physical blow. David had hired her from an agency that performed background checks. They had verified her immigration status and her references for housekeeping. They had never mentioned a degree. He had never asked. Why didn't you say anything? He asked, a wave of shame washing over him. Because you did not hire a teacher, she said simply. You hired a maid. And in this house, the teachers were the ones with the certificates and the high prices. I did not think my papers would matter. In that moment, David's entire worldview fractured. The hierarchy he had built in his mind, expert at the top, unskilled labor at the bottom, collapsed. The most qualified person to help his son had been cleaning his toilets for 2 years, and he had been spying on her, suspecting her of manipulation. He asked her to work with Leo formally. He offered to double, triple her salary. Marisol shook her head. Money is not the key, Mr. Chen. The key is time and consistency and heart. I will show you what to do, but you must do it. You are his father. The connection must come from you. And so David Chen, billionaire tech CEO, began his apprenticeship. After Marisol's cleaning shift, she would stay for an hour. She taught David the songs. She drilled him on the hand-clapping sequences until his businessman's hands, used to keyboards and touchscreens, could keep the rhythm. The first time David tried to sing the Little Bird song to Leo, his voice cracked with self-consciousness. Leo turned and walked out of the room. But Marisol was relentless. Again, she would say, without embarrassment, he does not judge your voice, he feels your intention. Within a week, something shifted. David was practicing a tapping game on the coffee table, absorbed in getting the pattern right, not even looking at Leo. He felt a presence. He looked up. Leo was standing next to the table, watching his hands. Slowly, Leo placed his own small hand next to David's and imitated a single tap. It was the first unprompted, physical initiation of contact Leo had ever made with his father. David broke down and wept. Marisol quietly left the room. Fueled by this breakthrough, David made a fateful decision. He called a meeting with Leo's lead therapist, Dr. Alistair Thorne. He excitedly presented his findings: the rhythmic engagement, the joint attention breakthrough, the value of nonverbal musical patterning. He expected collaboration, a fusion of methods. What he received was a wall of polite, condescending skepticism. Dr. Thorne, a man with an Ivy League pedigree and a $50,000 retainer, steepled his fingers. David, what you're describing is anecdotal. It's essentially facilitated play. While it's wonderful that Leo is engaged, we have no empirical data, no control groups, no peer-reviewed studies to support this as a methodology. Our applied behavioral analysis protocols are evidence-based. They are measurable, repeatable, and scientifically validated. David argued that the evidence was in his son's eyes, in his newly calm demeanor. Dr. Thorne dismissed it as a honeymoon period and a potentially harmful deviation from their structured plan. He implied, gently but firmly, that David was falling prey to the seductive myth of the magic bullet, often peddled by well-meaning but unqualified individuals. With all due respect, Thorne said, his tone turning icy, relying on the unstructured interventions of domestic staff could not only stall Leo's progress, but could actively undermine the professional framework we've built. If you choose to pursue this, folk medicine, I would have to reconsider my involvement, and I suspect the speech and occupational therapists would follow. It was an ultimatum. The very experts who had failed for years were now threatening to abandon his son if he did not abandon the one thing that was working. David was trapped between the system he had paid for and the truth he had witnessed with his own eyes. He made his choice. He thanked Dr. Thorne for his time and informed him their services would no longer be required. The following week, he terminated the contracts with the entire therapy team. The professional community was small and word spread quickly. David Chen, the billionaire, had fired his elite team in favor of Maid therapy. The backlash was immediate and vicious. An anonymous blog post on a popular autism parenting forum, likely written by a disgruntled former therapist, appeared. The title was scathing: "The Billionaire and the Quack, When Privilege Trumps Science." It painted Marisol as a cunning opportunist exploiting a desperate father, and David as a narcissist who thought his money could buy a shortcut past decades of research. The comments section erupted in fury. David was vilified. Then the email arrived. It was from the board of the prestigious Langley Autism Center, where David was a major donor. The politely worded message expressed deep concern about the unorthodox and potentially harmful practices being reported, and announced a temporary freeze on his pledged $5 million donation pending a review of shared values. His reputation, both as a father and a philanthropist, was crumbling. But the worst was yet to come. One evening, as David was practicing a clapping game with Leo, his phone rang. It was his wife, Elena, calling from her mother's house. Her voice was brittle with rage and fear. "David, what have you done? I'm getting calls from everyone. They're saying you've gone off the deep end, that you've fired all of Leo's doctors and are letting the maid perform exorcisms or something. Is it true? Are you putting our son at risk with some cleaning lady voodoo?" He tried to explain, to describe Leo's progress, the pointing, the shared moments. She cut him off. "I'm booking a flight home, and when I get there that woman is gone. Do you understand me? Gone. We are reinstating the professionals, and we are going to fix this mess you've made." The line went dead. David stood in the silent living room, the weight of his collapsing world on his shoulders. He had Leo's trust, a fragile newborn thing. He had Marisol's knowledge, and he had everyone else, the experts, the community, even his own wife, arrayed against him, ready to tear it all down. He looked at Marisol, who had heard the entire conversation from the hallway. Her face was not afraid, it was resolute. "The storm is here, Mr. Chen," she said quietly. "Now we see what is built on rock, and what is built on sand. And as if to underscore her point, the doorbell rang. Through the frosted glass of the front door, David could see the silhouette of a man in a suit, holding a large envelope. It was a process server. The first legal salvo had arrived. And as if to underscore her point, the doorbell rang. Through the frosted glass of the front door, David could see the silhouette of a man in a suit, holding a large envelope. It was a process server. The first legal salvo had arrived. The envelope contained a temporary restraining order and a petition for emergency custody. Elena, acting through her attorney, was alleging that David's radical and untested practices constituted emotional endangerment, creating an unstable and unsafe environment for Leo. She was asking the court to remove their son from the home immediately, pending a full psychological evaluation of David. David's hands trembled as he read the words. His own wife was using the system he had once worshipped to take his child away. The hearing was set for 72 hours. He had 3 days to prepare a defense against the woman who had shared his life for over a decade. When Elena arrived that evening, the house was a war zone of silence. She dropped her luggage in the foyer and marched straight to the living room, where David sat with the legal papers spread before him. She didn't greet him. Her eyes went to Leo, who was sitting on the floor with Marisol, their hands moving in a slow, synchronized clapping pattern. Leo was making a soft, humming sound, matching Marisol's pitch. "Stop that," Elena snapped, her voice sharp. Leo flinched, his hands freezing in midair. The humming ceased. He curled into himself, a familiar protective ball. The progress of weeks vanished in an instant. Marisol stood up slowly, placing herself subtly between Leo and his mother. "Senora, please," he was communicating. "Get away from my son," Elena said, each word a shard of ice. "You're fired. Pack your things and get out of my house." David stood. "Elena, no, you don't understand what's happening here." "I understand perfectly. I come home to find you've destroyed our son's support system. You're the laughingstock of every autism group in the state, and you're letting this woman perform witchcraft on our child. Look at these." She snatched the legal papers from the table. "The court will see it too." A fierce, protective rage, one he didn't know he possessed, rose in David. "You will not speak to her that way. You will not come into this home and undo in 5 seconds what has taken months to build. Look at him, Elena, really look." Elena turned her furious gaze back to Leo. He was still curled up, but now he was rocking, his eyes fixed on Marisol's feet, a low, anxious sound emanating from his throat. It was a regression to his old state, triggered by her anger. For the first time, a flicker of doubt crossed Elena's face. She had seen that exact behavior 1,000 times before. She had never seen the calm, engaged child of moments earlier. Marisol, with a dignity that seemed to fill the room, spoke. "Senora Chen, I will leave if you wish, but first, may I show you one thing for Leo?" Elena, against her own anger, gave a stiff nod. Marisol did not approach Leo. She sat back on the floor a few feet away and began to sing. It was a different song, a gentle, flowing lullaby. She sang in Spanish, her voice a warm, steady current. She did not look at Leo, just sang to the empty air. Slowly, the anxious rocking slowed. The humming sound stopped. After a full minute, Leo uncurled. He turned his head. He looked at Marisol, then at his mother, then back at Marisol. And then he did something he had never, ever done in his mother's presence. He crawled. He crawled the 3 feet to Marisol and laid his head in her lap. Elena's hand flew to her mouth. A choked sob escaped. For 5 years, she had ached for her son to seek comfort from her. He had never done it, not once, and now he was doing it with the maid. The pain on her face was absolute. "What have you done?" she whispered to David, her anger replaced by devastation. "I've been trying to listen," David said, his own voice thick, "and she taught me how." That night, a tense truce held. Marisol stayed at David's insistence. Elena retreated to a guest room, the legal papers lying untouched on the kitchen counter. But the storm was far from over. The next morning, David's chief counsel called. The story had leaked to a major tech blog. The headline was brutal: "Custody battle erupts as Synapse CEO embraces folk healing for autistic son." The article painted David as an unstable eccentric and hinted at a mysterious domestic worker with a questionable background. Commenters were calling for a boycott of his company. David's board of directors demanded an emergency meeting. His stock price began to dip. The personal was now catastrophically professional. Then the second blow landed. A private investigator, hired by Elena's attorney, had done a deep dive into Marisol's past. The investigator didn't find a criminal record. He found something, in their view, worse. Marisol's teaching degree from Mexico was not recognized by the state's licensing board. Furthermore, the school she had worked at in Oaxaca had been shut down 3 years prior in a bureaucratic dispute over special needs certification. In the hands of a ruthless lawyer, it was ammunition, uncertified, unlicensed, and previously employed by a defunct, non-compliant institution. Elena's attorney pounced. He filed a supplemental motion, alleging David had not only introduced untested methods, but had done so under the guidance of an unqualified individual with a history of operating outside regulatory standards. The hearing was no longer just about David's judgment. It was about Marisol's legitimacy. David was in his study, desperately reviewing immigration law, trying to see if Marisol could be vulnerable when she knocked on the door. Her face was calm, but her eyes held a deep sorrow. "Mr. Chen, I must go," she said. "My presence is hurting your family and your life. I will be a problem in your court." David refused. "You are the only thing that's helped my son. I won't throw you to the wolves." "You do not understand," she said, and for the first time her voice broke. "In my country, after the school closed, I worked for a family, a wealthy family with a boy much like Leo. I used the same songs, the same games." He began to speak, just a few words. His grandmother, she called it a miracle. But the father, he was a doctor. He said I was practicing medicine without a license. He had me arrested. The charges, they were dropped, but my name, it was ruined. I could not teach again. That is why I came here. That is why I clean houses. David felt the floor drop away. This was the "it gets worse" moment. Marisol wasn't just unlicensed in America. She had a history in another country of being accused of the very thing David was now being accused of. In a custody battle, this was catastrophic. Elena's attorney would eviscerate her on the stand. "Why didn't you tell me?" David asked, his mind reeling. "Because it is not a crime to sing to a child," she said, her defiance returning. "Because what they call practicing medicine, I call being a human being, but the court will not see it that way. I see now, it is the same everywhere. If you do not have the paper, you do not have the right to help." She was right. The system, whether in Oaxaca or California, was built on credentials. Her lived experience, her generational knowledge, counted for nothing. Less than nothing, it was a liability. David had a choice. He could let Marisol disappear, try to replicate her methods himself, and fight the custody battle on narrower, safer ground. Or he could stake everything, his son, his company, his reputation, on defending a woman the world saw as a fraud, and on a philosophy that valued heart over credentials. He thought of Leo's head in Marisol's lap. He thought of the first shared tap of a hand. He thought of the pointing finger and the cardinal. He had spent his life building walls of logic and money. Now he had to tear them down. "You're not leaving," David said, his voice firm with a new resolve. "We're going to court, and we're not going to apologize for you. We're going to put you on the stand. We're going to put Leo on the stand. We're going to put the songs on trial." Marisol stared at him, disbelief turning to a glimmer of hope. "They will tear me apart." "Maybe," David said, "but they'll have to tear me apart first. We're not hiding from this fight anymore. We are bringing it to them." He picked up the phone and called his lawyer. "Pull the supplemental motion. We're changing our strategy. We're not playing defense. We're going on offense. I want to subpoena Dr. Alastair Thorne. I want to subpoena the board of the Langley Center. And I want to hire the best independent child development experts in the world to observe and document what happens in this house for the next 48 hours. We're not just fighting for custody. We're putting the entire system on trial." He hung up and looked at Marisol. The battle lines were drawn. The quiet sunroom where they had sung lullabies was now the epicenter of a war that would challenge the very definition of healing, expertise, and a parent's right to choose. In 72 hours, they would walk into a courtroom. And David Chen, for the first time in his life, was going to fight not with data, but with a song. And David Chen, for the first time in his life, was going to fight not with data, but with a song. The family court of Judge Anya Sharma was not designed for miracles. It was a room of wood paneling, fluorescent lights, and the slow, grinding machinery of the law. On one side sat David, Marisol, and their attorney. On the other, Elena and her formidable lawyer. In the gallery, Dr. Thorne watched with a detached, academic air. But the true witness sat between David and Marisol, swinging his legs under a too big chair, Leo. Elena's attorney, a man named Caldwell, opened with a surgical attack. He methodically laid out David's reckless firing of the professional team. He entered into evidence the damning blog posts and the Langley Center's letter. Then he turned his sights on Marisol. He entered the records of the closed school in Oaxaca. He highlighted her lack of state certification. And then, with theatrical gravity, he introduced the police report from Mexico regarding the unauthorized practice of medicine. "Your Honor," Caldwell intoned, "we have a father under immense stress who has been seduced by a narrative of magical thinking promoted by an individual with a documented history of operating outside legal and professional boundaries. This isn't therapy, it is exploitation, and it endangers the child." David's lawyer, a sharp woman named Jacobs, didn't flinch. When it was her turn, she called her first witness, Dr. Lillian Reed, a world-renowned developmental psychologist from Stanford, one of the independent experts David had hired to observe. "Dr. Reed," Jacobs began, "you observed Leo Chen over a 48-hour period. What did you see?" Dr. Reed, a woman in her 60s with calm eyes, described the scenes. She described the rhythmic hand games, the use of song, the structured nonverbal turn-taking. She did not use words like miracle or magic. She used terms like sensoromotor synchronization, nonverbal joint attention, and regulation through predictable rhythmic input. "And how would you categorize these interactions in terms of accepted therapeutic frameworks?" Jacobs asked. "They align closely with principles of music therapy and relational developmental approaches," Dr. Reed stated. "While the delivery is cultural and informal, the mechanisms, predictability, rhythmic entrainment, shared focus, without linguistic demand, are clinically sound. In my professional opinion, these interactions are not harmful. They are, for this child, demonstrably engaging and regulatory." Caldwell leapt up for cross-examination. "But these are just observations, doctor. Where are the controlled studies? Where is the data proving this specific Maid's specific folk songs are effective?" Dr. Reed smiled thinly. "The first language of humanity was not text, counsel, it was rhythm and melody. We have studies on music therapy. We have less on specific folk songs because academia rarely studies the cultural practices of indigenous villages in Oaxaca. That does not make them invalid. It makes our research limited." The gallery murmured. Jacobs then called her second witness, David. She had him describe Leo before the silence, the isolation, the failed therapies. She had him describe the moment he saw Leo smile on the camera. She had him describe the pointing, the head in the lap, the shared tap. David spoke not as a CEO, but as a father, his voice raw with emotion. Then Jacobs did the unthinkable. "Your Honor, permission to treat Marisol Vasquez as an expert witness in the practices she employs." Caldwell objected vehemently. "She has no credentials. She is not an expert." Judge Sharma, a keen-eyed woman who had seen everything, overruled him. "I'll allow it. I'm interested in what she has to say." Marisol took the stand. Under Jacob's gentle questioning, she spoke not of pathology, but of personhood. She explained the concept of El Niño de la Luna. She described how the songs were not just tunes, but vessels of history and connection. She explained that for a child overwhelmed by the chaos of words, a simple, repeating melody was a rope he could hold onto. "It is not about making him normal," she said, her voice clear. "It is about meeting him where he is, in his country, and my songs are a passport to that country." Caldwell approached for cross-examination, a predator moving in. He grilled her on her qualifications. He highlighted the closed school. Then he landed the blow everyone expected. He entered the Mexican police report into evidence and had her read the accusation, practicing medicine without a license. "Is this not true, Ms. Vasquez?" Weren't you arrested for doing the very thing you're doing here? Marisol looked directly at him, then at the judge. I was arrested for singing a homesick boy a song from his mother's village. The charges were dropped because no crime had been committed, only a connection. Frustrated, Caldwell changed tactics. And you expect this court to believe that your folk songs are more effective than the science-backed, million-dollar therapies Mr. Chen foolishly abandoned. Before Marisol could answer, a sound cut through the courtroom, a low, anxious hum. Leo, overwhelmed by the tension, the lights, the strange voices, had begun to rock violently in his chair, his hands over his ears. Elena moved to go to him, but David held up a hand, looking at Marisol. Judge Sharma, concerned, said, "The child is distressed. Do we need a recess?" Marisol stood up from the witness stand. "With the court's permission, Your Honor." The judge nodded, curiosity overriding protocol. Marisol walked to the well of the court, sat on the floor right there in front of the judge's bench, and began to sing. It was the little bird's song. Softly, gently, she tapped a rhythm on the polished floor. The entire courtroom froze. Caldwell looked outraged. Dr. Thorne leaned forward, his academic detachment gone. Elena watched, her hand over her heart. David held his breath. Leo's rocking slowed, the humming faded. He peeked through his fingers. He saw Marisol on the floor. He slowly lowered his hands. Then he slid out of his chair. He walked to her. He sat down facing her. And he placed his hands on the floor, attempting to mimic her tapping pattern. A calm settled over him, visible to everyone in the room. In the profound silence that followed, Judge Sharma spoke, her voice soft. "No recess necessary." That moment broke the case. When court resumed, Elena's attorney had lost his venom. His arguments sounded hollow after the courtroom had witnessed, in real time, the unproven method, regulate a child in distress when nothing else could. When it was time for Elena to take the stand, Jacobs asked only one question. "Mrs. Chen, what do you want for your son?" Elena looked at Leo, now calmly stacking crayons Marisol had produced from her purse. She looked at David, who gave her a slow, understanding nod. Then she looked at the judge, tears streaming down her face. "I want my son back," she whispered, "and it seems he was found in a place I never thought to look." She withdrew her petition for emergency custody. Judge Sharma's ruling was a masterclass of nuance. She granted David and Elena joint legal custody, with primary physical custody to David, noting the stability of his current approach. She mandated that Marisol's methods be formally documented and integrated with a new, supportive professional team chosen by the parents. She dismissed the allegations against David's judgment. And in a final, groundbreaking note in her order, she wrote, "This court recognizes that competency can be demonstrated through effect, not solely through credential. Ms. Vasquez's contributions are hereby recognized as a valid component of the child's care plan." It was a total vindication, but the surprises were not over. As they exited the courtroom, Dr. Thorne approached them, not with anger, but with humility. "That was instructive," he said to Marisol. "I would be grateful to learn more about the rhythmic frameworks you use. There may be a place for this in our clinical models." A week later, the story had a new headline. "From Courtroom to Collaboration, Folk Traditions Inform New Autism Therapy Model." The Langley Center reinstated David's donation and invited Marisol to consult on a new community outreach program. David's board, seeing the public relations disaster transform into a story of innovation and compassion, rallied behind him. But the final surprise, the one that made David's world stop, came on a quiet afternoon 2 months later. He was in the sunroom with Leo, practicing a tapping game. David was singing the little bird's song, badly off-key. Leo was watching his hands, a small smile on his face. David finished the song and said, "Okay, your turn, buddy." Leo looked up, met his father's eyes, and in a voice soft as a whisper, clear as a bell, he said, "Pajaro." The word hung in the air, bird. David stared, unable to breathe. Leo pointed to the window where a sparrow had landed. "Pajaro," he said again, then looked back at David and tapped his hand twice. The game, the word, the connection, it was all one. David gathered his son into his arms, weeping freely. From the doorway, Marisol and Elena watched, their own eyes shining. The locked door had not been broken down by force or expertise. It had been opened by a melody, a rhythm, and a love patient enough to speak a language beyond words. The empire David had built now seemed like a distant, hollow country. His true fortune was in this sunlit room, in the sound of a single word, and in the profound understanding that the most advanced technology in the world was, and had always been, the human heart. And as David held his son, he knew their story was no longer about fixing what was broken, but about celebrating a different, beautiful way of being. A journey that was just beginning. A journey that was just beginning. David Chen's story asks a difficult, beautiful question. What do we miss when we only listen to the experts? For years, he operated on the belief that the most expensive solution, backed by the most impressive credentials, must be the best one. It was a logic that built his fortune, but it nearly cost him his son. The breakthrough didn't come from a lab or a clinic. It came from a tradition older than psychology, carried in the memory of a woman the system had labeled unqualified. Marisol didn't have a proprietary method. She had lullabies. She had rhythms passed from grandmother to granddaughter. She had a simple, radical idea, to speak to Leo not in the language of his deficits, but in the music of his own sensory world. This isn't a story about rejecting science. It is a story about expanding our definition of it. Science measures, but it does not always feel. It validates through repetition, but it can miss the singular, miraculous connection that defies the pattern. What Marisol offered was a different kind of data, the data of the human heart, of patience, of cultural wisdom that exists outside of peer-reviewed journals. Leo's first word, Pajaro, bird, was more than a milestone. It was a bridge built note by note, clap by clap, across a chasm everyone said was uncrossable. It proved that communication is not a one-way street of input and output. It is a dance. And sometimes you have to let the other person lead, even if their steps are silence or a hum or a rhythm tapped on the floor. Today, the Chen household sounds different. The rigid schedules of therapy have been replaced by a fluid rhythm of song, play, and quiet companionship. Marisol is no longer their maid. She is their cultural guide and developmental consultant, her methods now being documented in partnership with researchers who finally want to listen. David and Elena, united in their awe of their son's unfolding world, have founded a non-profit that connects families with practitioners trained in both evidence-based and culturally informed, music-centered approaches. The most profound change, however, is in David himself. The man who sought control above all else has learned the power of surrender, not giving up, but giving over to a different way of knowing. He discovered that the greatest algorithm, the one that could decode his son's heart, was not written in code, but in the timeless language of melody and touch. We live in a world that worships complexity and distrusts simplicity. We chase the next big thing, the cutting-edge treatment, often overlooking the ancient, quiet truths that have soothed human souls for millennia. David's journey reminds us that sometimes the key is not in looking forward, but in looking back, in listening to the songs our grandparents sang, in valuing the hands that comfort, not just the degrees that certify. The next time you face an impossible problem, a locked door that won't yield to force or logic, remember Leo and his bird. Remember that the answer might not be louder or more expensive or more credentialed. It might be a whisper, a rhythm, a simple, persistent melody of love waiting for you to be quiet enough to hear it. If this story found an echo in your heart, share it with someone who might need to hear it today. And don't forget to subscribe and join us for more journeys into the extraordinary stories hidden in ordinary lives. Until next time.